So we see here where, you know, we're going to look into this situation with Sudan, but we want to get like a perspective on it to know exactly what is going on based on what really is happening on the ground. So we're going to look at that today. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to start off with, you know what I'm saying, a little legs on that. So we want to we take it from the
essentially, a collection of people. I wouldn't categorize it as a civil war because that would suggest that you have essentially, a collection of people, a group of people fighting another. This is essentially a power struggle, really, between General Abdel Fattah Burhan, the general of the standing army, and as you noted in your report, in your introduction, the head of a paramilitary militia, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. So, unfortunately, the civilians are held hostage. So it's not so much a civil war, but essentially a fight to the death between two generals who have been partners and allies in the past. The consequences, unfortunately, for a city, the capital city that is houses approximately 8 to 10 million people, is unprecedented in terms of the catastrophe, as your reporting has shown. It's not only that there are over 500 people that have perished, that's of course probably clearly an underestimation, but the humanitarian consequences in the city, basically the infrastructure has completely collapsed. It's not just that the supplies of food are not there, but also people are generally trying to flee the city, and most cannot. But thousands are fleeing northwards towards Egypt or towards the Red Sea. In the east, there are also clashes in the western province of Darfur. Sudanese there are fleeing to Chad across the borders. This is unprecedented in terms of the kind of violence that has really the capital city has witnessed. So I would really categorize it less as a civil war, as basically a conflict between two generals who are basically trying to take over political control over the country. I wouldn't categorize it as a civil war because that would suggest that you have.
Itself, you know what I'm saying? So we see where he explains that situation. So now we're going to take another.
Essentially,
we're going to look at another one.
I wouldn't categorize it as a civil war because that would suggest that you have
his situation on the ground with that. And
absolutely. I think for your viewers, it's important to understand that these two generals had conspired and were partners in upending the very fragile coalition government in October 2021 that had been set up after the historic revolution of 2019, where millions of Sudanese took to the streets, not only in the capital of Khartoum, but throughout the country, that overthrew 30 years of an Islamist authoritarian dictatorship under the rule of the former president Omar Bashir. After that revolution, there was a coalition government that was supposed to oversee the country to transition towards a civilian democracy and elections that would consolidate that. But on October 2021, both of these generals, one was the head of the army and his deputy was actually now is the head of these militias, Dagalo, decided basically to wage a coup to upend that democratic experiment of the transition to democracy. Following that, protests in Sudan continued. The will of the Sudanese people with respect to continuing on the road to full civilian democracy continued, forcing and compelling these two generals to actually get back to the table with civilian politicians and iron out what was called a framework agreement under the auspices of the international community, the Quad, the actors from the international community included the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. That framework agreement was supposed to restart and revitalize this transition to a civilian democracy. But there were three essential contentious issues that really have sparked this particular conflict. One of them had to do with the issue of accountability, that is transitional justice, the accountability on part of both these generals, because on the one hand, Hemeti had been accused of violence in the Darfur region. He was responsible for really thousands of civilians in Darfur, putting down that insurgency in the 2000s. And Burhan himself, who cooperated with that, but also both of them actually repressed
And
the
probably ran off a
activists
lot of
on the street.
Africans from there
In
too.
June of 2019, both of them and their forces essentially killed over 100 activists that had been in a sitting trying to energize this revolution. And another issue was the dismantling of the economic empire that had been built by the former regime, overseen now by Burhan, and also dismantling the vast wealth that Hemeti, the militia leader, had really amassed through the smuggling of gold, cooperation with the Wagner Corporation, and also sending mercenaries to the war in Yemen. These were two essential kind of contentious issues. But the one that really sparked this conflict was an issue over integrating the paramilitary militia into the standing army. That is really where the dispute emerged, leading to this horrible conflict. On the one hand, General Burhan had wanted the paramilitary militia for integrating the paramilitary as the dismantling of the economic empire that had been built by the former regime, overseen now by Burhan, and also dismantling the vast wealth that Hemeti, the militia leader, had really amassed through the smuggling of gold, cooperation with the Wagner Corporation, and also sending mercenaries to the war in Yemen. These were two essential kind of contentious issues. But the one that really sparked this conflict was an issue over integrating the paramilitary militia into the standing army. That is really where the dispute emerged, leading to this horrible conflict. On the one hand, General Burhan had wanted the paramilitary militia to be integrated within the course of 2 years. Very quick integration, after which he could consolidate his rule over the military establishment. On the other hand, Hemeti, or Dagalo, the head of the paramilitary militia, wanted this to happen over the course of 10 years, essentially basically rejecting integrating his paramilitary forces into the national standing army. It is at that point that both decided or calculated that they had to actually defeat their rival. Quickly, Dagalo, the head of the paramilitary militia, began mobilizing even more forces in Khartoum and throughout the neighborhoods of the capital city, and also attacking an airport in Medawi in northern Sudan. That mobilization is what I game. The Sudanese population throughout the country is held hostage to the ambitions, the political and economic ambitions of these two generals. So it's not a civil war. It really is, unfortunately, the kind of result of this kind of greed for power and their interest in maintaining their vast economic assets and empire, both built in the course of unfortunately, that it would devolve into a proxy war, because these two generals had already been utilized as proxies by certain powers. In the case of Hemeti, there is absolutely no question that the Wagner Corporation, or the mercenaries of Wagner, had helped in amassing the gold, and that was smuggled not only to Russia eventually, but the majority of it actually to the United Arab Emirates, markets in Dubai. That's very important. As I said, he also served in the past as a mercenary, being sent to Yemen at the behest in support.
Well, where we see where we're catching on to a lot of this as we go. You know what I'm saying? As we go. Because it's important for us to know what it is that is going on the ground. You know what I'm saying? So we now have to look at that 1 second, people, on that situation. We have to make sure that we understand these things, because a lot of this is people in Africa that don't belong in Sudan. Sudan is in the same region as Ethiopia and all of that, and that's why you see the conflict is in Ethiopia as well, because these are Arabs or people who do not belong there but claiming on TV, using these different scientists and people to tell you that Africa's the land wasn't for African people, or African people weren't there, or they have no history, they have no belongings to it. And then when they speak of these conflicts, they don't explain to them who it is they were driving off out of Egypt in the Darfur region. It was black people that were living there for thousands of years and had documents leading to showing their authenticity of that land. And they need no authenticity because, excuse me 1 minute, because even the digging up of sorry about that, even the digging up of Africa's stuff out of Africa was it was definitely some bull when you look at it. You know what I'm saying? It's really some bull. You know what I'm saying? And they allowed that to happen because black people sit up there right there and probably helped them to do it more ways than one. But in many times, in many of your old days, you know what I'm saying, many of the kings did not play with that grave robbing stuff. You know what I'm saying? That's why a lot of the execution for people who were stealing from the graves, you know what I'm saying, of the Egyptians, the execution was very brutal. Now I'm saying in more ways than one. And a lot of the artifacts they were selling to foreigners and different people. They've been raiding Egypt and this for years, you know what I'm saying, and using this. That's why you see when you see the mummy and stuff, you see the guy that's running around being a little shiesty little weasel with them. He's wearing a fez on his head. You know what I'm saying? But let's continue.
Unfortunately, that it would devolve into a proxy war because these two generals had already been utilized as proxies by certain powers. In the case of Hemeti, there is absolutely no question that the Wagner Corporation or the mercenaries of Wagner had helped in amassing the gold, and that was smuggled not only to Russia eventually, but the majority of it actually to the United Arab Emirates, markets in Dubai. That's very important. As I said, he also served in the past as a mercenary. Being sent to Yemen at the behest in support of Yemen, of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in that war. Another very important aspect of Hemeti is that he does have close link with Haftar, Khalifa Haftar of the Libyan National Army.
See, that's all Arab. That's not African.
Hemeti had also sent soldiers from his paramilitary militia.
Those are all Africans. That's African land. When we really look at it, in more ways than one, that's Africans, and that's who they were driving off in Darfur. They didn't want none of the African people that were living there for years and years of their lives, grew up there and everything. They was going around killing them. You know what I'm saying? When you take a look at the movie Darfur, you see the Arab people were going around killing the African people, then running them off the Egyptian plateau in which their ancestors. And then when they tried to go into Egypt for, their own ancestors' land, you had the Ottoman Turks, and they're driving them off. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of this then when you go up the river, they're fighting on many, many different grounds.
Sisi in Egypt supports him because he's very much opposed to a democratic evolution in Sudan, but also deeply concerned about Egypt's interest with respect to the Nile waters. What I want to emphasize in terms of answering your question in this context is the strategic location of Sudan. I think many people are unaware how important it is located. It not only borders the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, which is so important. Russia historically has really wanted to have a naval base there and had been working out an agreement to do so. That, of course, is a great concern to the United States and, of course, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So there's a scramble for control over the strategic location of the port in Sudan on the Red Sea. Sudan also, of course, shares the Nile waters with Egypt and Ethiopia. Those two countries, as you probably know, have been in conflict and intention over the establishment of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Egypt in particular has been concerned. South Sudan, for those viewers who may not be aware, does have a great deal of oil. It exports to China, but that oil has to go through a pipeline in Sudan. That becomes really important. So the strategic location of Sudan is the main reason that there's Egypt and Ethiopia, those two countries, to do so. That, of course, is a great concern to the United States and, of course, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So there's a scramble for control over the strategic location of the port in Sudan on the Red Sea. Sudan also, of course, shares the Nile waters with Egypt and Ethiopia. Those two countries, as you probably know, have been in conflict and intention over the establishment of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Egypt in particular has been concerned. South Sudan, for those viewers who may not be aware, does have a great deal of oil. It exports to China, but that oil has to go through a pipeline in Sudan. That becomes really important. So the strategic location of Sudan is the main reason that there's a great danger of this conflict not only destabilizing Sudan, which it has, of course, in the capital city and throughout the country, but the entire region, as the different actors understand, and they are very quickly, that their own strategic interests and their conflicts with their rivals may actually be undermined if Sudan's stability completely evaporates.
On Friday.
You see? So they ain't fooling nobody. That's African land. You know what I'm saying? That's African land.